Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia Meyers and I am the piccolo player in the Boston Symphony Orchestra. This is my piccolo. I'm here today to share with you a whole bunch of different instruments that are all members of the flute family. And the flutes are a member of a larger family called the Woodwind family. Now I'm going to play for you first my piccolo, which it is my job in the orchestra to play. It is a member of the flute family, as you can see. Just like my flute, I have a hole in the very top where I blow my air, and then a whole series of keys that are down the body of the instrument. The difference between the two not only is what they're made of. My flute is made of silver and my piccolo is made of wood, but they are also quite a bit different in size. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about. I'm going to play a little excerpt on my piccolo, and then I'm going to play it on my flute, and I want you to listen carefully to hear what the difference might be. That was my piccolo, and here is my flute. So, if you guessed one is lower than the other, you guessed correctly. My flute, because it's so much bigger than my piccolo, has a much lower sound. The piccolo is the highest member of the orchestra. We can play higher than anybody else, maybe with the exception of the violin. But it can soar over the orchestra and you can almost always hear it. Because the flute and the piccolo can play so high and we can play fast, composers will oftentimes give us parts in the orchestra that depict, well, I'm going to play it first and you see if you can guess what animal this is. Does anybody recognize that? It's the bird from Peter and the Wolf. And because the flute has such a high voice, composers oftentimes think it sounds like the bird. And the same thing is true of the piccolo. Doesn't it sound like a bird tweeting outside your window? The composer Maurice Ravel certainly thought so, and he used the piccolo in his piece called Daphnis and Chloe to depict the birds at the beginning of the day. The flute and the piccolo, we make our sound exactly the same way. And actually I'm going to show you how we make that sound on an instrument that's a little bit strange, but all of you have in your house. This is a soda bottle. And I make my sound on the flute exactly the same way I would make my sound on a soda bottle. If you take a soda bottle, it can be a water bottle, anything that has a smaller top than a bottom, and you take your air and you blow it across, you can make a sound. I'm sure many of you have tried that. Well, the same thing is true on my flute or my piccolo. If I take the head joint off and blow my air across the top, and then I can make funny sounds with it. It's kind of fun to do. But I make my sound exactly the same way that you make your sound blowing air across a soda bottle. When I put the head joint together and I move the keys, I make the sound of the flute. Now, the flute is the oldest instrument that we know of, and I have a picture I'd like to share with you of this very ancient flute. This flute is about 30,000 years, I said, not 30 years or 300 years, 30,000 years old. And this flute was found in an archaeological dig in Germany. And they discovered it was made from an animal bone. And early humans really needed to make music. We found that that has been important to us since the beginning of time. And the flute was an easy one to do because all you needed to do was hollow out a bone and put holes in it. And if you blew just the same way we blew across that pop bottle, you could make music. And so the flute goes back a very, very long way. And I'm going to play a flute for you now that I bet many of you have seen, but you may not know it's actually a flute. This is also an early flute, not 30,000 years old, but about 300 years old. And I bet many of you have played this flute in maybe third grade, second grade, when you get a chance to play it in your schools. That's a recorder. Let me see if I can play a tune. So I bet many of you have played that instrument. But did you know it was actually an early flute? Even though I don't hold it to the side like I hold my flute, I still have that hole in the very top of it. And I have no reed like a clarinet or an oboe or a bassoon. I have no mouthpiece to buzz in like a brass instrument. All that we do is blow air through a hole or over a hole, and that air vibrates. And when I cover different holes on the tube itself, it changes the pitches. So, believe it or not, this was a flute. Now, I think I said earlier in the beginning of our talk that the flutes and the piccolos were members of the Woodwind family. Now, I have my early flute, my recorder that's made out of wood, and my piccolo that's made out of wood. But my flute is made out of silver, and I actually have a piccolo that's made out of silver. Now, wait a minute. I said that we were members of the Woodwind family. Why in the world, if we're members of the Woodwind family, would the flute and this piccolo in particular be made out of silver? Well, there's actually a very good answer to that question. Long, long, long ago, when we were first experimenting with music as we know it now, they didn't have silver to make flutes with. They were using silver to make things like utensils to eat with, or fancy pitchers and bowls and things like that. Nobody had ever thought to use silver to actually make an instrument you could just as easily make out of wood. So in the early days, even in flutes that are held to the side or transverse flutes, those flutes were made out of wood. But as orchestras got bigger, as years progressed and composers got more creative and more things were available to them in terms of instruments, the orchestras got quite a bit bigger. And it was a little bit more difficult to hear those old-fashioned wooden flutes through all of that brass and all of those strings. So a man in France began to experiment with making flutes out of silver, and they brought those flutes to the United States in the early 1900s. And once orchestras heard those instruments being played, we have really never gone back because the sound of the silver can carry through an orchestra so much easier than wood. Now, my piccolo is, the instrument I play is still made out of wood, but if you listen really carefully, I don't think anybody's going to have any trouble hearing that. Where on the flute, it's a little bit mellower. So instrument makers decided it might not be a bad idea, in order to keep the sound of the piccolo prettier and rounder, to actually keep that instrument made out of wood. And so most of the time, even though I have a silver piccolo that sometimes I'll take outside to play, if I'm playing in a park or an outdoor concert, it really doesn't sound much different, except it's a little bit more piercing. That's really high. That's the highest note I can play. I don't play this instrument in the orchestra very much. The other thing I wanted to share with you was this instrument, which is actually the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of the piccolo. This instrument is called a fife. And if any of you have ever gone to Lexington and Concord or seen any Patriots Day parades where they have fife and drum corps, that's what this instrument is. It was used in the military long ago, and it was easy to carry. It was an instrument that it was the job of someone who was maybe 12 years old, 13 years old to play. Along with being a drummer boy, you also could play the fife. And it was their job to use this instrument to signal whether or not they were going to charge into battle or whether or not they should retreat from battle. If you put a lot of them together, they can make quite a bit of noise, but I'll play it for you. You can hear it. So can you imagine somebody who's 12 years old, that being their job? That was a pretty scary job, I think. But because it was so light, they could put it in their pocket. It was easy to carry. It was easy to transport. So this was actually an early piccolo. Same member of the flute family, different purpose. Now, I said earlier that the higher the instrument, the smaller the instrument, and the bigger the instrument, the lower the instrument. So I'm going to pull this one out, which is one of my favorites. And you can see, I'm going to compare it all to my flute, how big that instrument is. So it's so big that I have to have a curved head joint on the top in order for me to be able to reach all of those keys. But would it still be a flute, even though it's so big? Well, the clue is, look at the very top. If you see that same hole in the very top, just like our soda bottle, that we can blow air across, then it's a flute. And this is indeed a flute. It's called an alto flute. And because of its size, remember, the bigger the instrument, the lower the sound. So I'm going to play the same thing I played on my flute and piccolo and give you an idea of what that sounds like. You can hear how low and mysterious that sounds. I guarantee most of you have heard this instrument, and in a place you might not have expected it. I'm going to play a little melody and see if you can tell me what this is. Does anybody recognize that from Harry Potter? The composer, John Williams, thought the alto flute would be perfect for that melody because it's so low and so mysterious sounding. So it's a very interesting flute. It's used for a different color in the orchestra, and it adds a little bit of bottom to our flute section. So I have one more I want to show you. I have to maybe use two hands for this, but we'll see. I have a question. Is that a flute? I don't even know if my screen is big enough to show you this. But if you look at the difference, oh my gosh, we've just gotten bigger, right? But if you look at the similarities, is it still a flute? Well, look at the top. That hole in the very top of the head joint tells you that that is a flute. I have no reed, I have no mouthpiece, I just have that hole to blow my air across up. So, it's not an alto flute, it's not a regular flute, it's certainly not a recorder, a fife, or a piccolo. It's called a bass flute. And this has a very low sound. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to hold. It's so big. That's really low. It's a very cool sound, and it takes a whole lot of air to play it. It really does. I'll play it again. That's the bass flute. This instrument doesn't show up a whole lot in the orchestra, but there are times that contemporary composers will use it, definitely for color and atmosphere, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sound, believe it or not, even though it's so big. Because it takes so much air to play it, it's hard to play it loud. Unlike the tuba. We can play the tuba pretty loud, but it's got a much bigger mouthpiece, and it's a much easier instrument to play loud. So those are all my members of the flute family. I'm going to finish up by playing the rest of this tune for you on my piccolo. Let me find it. And I think I'm going to play something different. I'm going to play a piece for you by George Philip Telemann. Telemann is one of my favorite composers because his music is so much fun to listen to. It's so happy, and even if it's in a sad minor key, it's still bright and exciting to listen to. And when I'm feeling a little down or a little bored, like I am quite a bit now, I play this music and I usually feel better. So I'm going to play for you the second movement of his Fantasy in A minor, which is written for flute alone, but I like the piece so much, I think it works pretty well on my piccolo. Boy, that was fun to play. So one of the questions I get an awful lot from students and from actually even grown-ups is, how much do you practice? Well, I practice a lot, and it takes a lot of practice to be able to become a member of an orchestra like the Boston Symphony. And now when I don't have the Boston Symphony, when we can't go to work at this point, we have a lot of time to practice at home. And I'm very, very glad to be able to do that, because playing my instrument every day just really makes me feel good. And not only that, even though I'm already in a great orchestra and I'm a professional, I still need to practice to get better. And that's how we get better at anything, is practicing every day. So if you play an instrument, that's the best thing you can possibly do, is take time every single day to practice, even if it's just a little bit, because that little bit over time makes you a better player, and you're able to see how far you can progress and how much fun it really is to play an instrument. I love my job in the Boston Symphony. I love going to work playing with other musicians who love music as much as I do. I love sitting in the middle of that incredible sound when you're listening to these amazing instruments, and the violins and the cellos and the basses and the French horns and the clarinets and the oboes and the flutes and the percussion and the brass, all working together to make such an incredible, glorious sound. It is just so much fun. So I love going to work. I love the Boston Symphony. I can't wait to get back there and play for you all, which I'm sure we will do very soon. So until then, have fun, keep practicing, and we'll see you at a Boston Symphony concert someday, I hope. Bye-bye.